39 minutes past the hour of 7, and you are still watching Sunrise at Sea and just in time for the Twitter jabs. Now, this morning we're going to be looking at human rights violation. In particular, we're going to be looking at the rampant torture cases that have seemed to have escalated in Uganda. Now, according to the Uganda Constitution, it provides that no person shall be subjected to torture or cruel, inhuman, or even disregarding treatment or punishment. And joining me at the center of this conversation is none other than Mr. Jude Byamukama, and Jude is an advocate in the Uganda Courts of the Judicial and managing partner in J. Byamukama and Co-Advocates. He holds an LLB and honors degree from the Makerere University, together with a postgraduate diploma in legal practice from the Law Development Center. Now, he also has extensive experience in legal practice. Good morning, Jude, and thank you for joining us this morning on Sunrise at Sea.
Hey. Good morning, Shivan. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, we're also excited to have you. Yes. So this morning, we're going to be talking about the human rights question. I mean, it has been a conversation that has been going on social media. Different TV stations have been reporting about it. We have had influential leaders come out and even condemn it. We have had the Fountain of Power come out and strongly condemn it. We have had the AIGP, that is Asan Kasindi, also come out to condemn it. We have had the Archbishop Paul Semogere also come out and say that these acts of torture need to be stopped in Uganda. However, in your opinion, on a scale of 10, would you say that Uganda is observing human rights?
I think on a scale of 10, I would give Uganda 4 out of 10.
If you were my teacher, I would be in trouble.
Because the 4 is about largely, on paper we have a framework that requires us to respect human rights. In the Constitution we have a whole chapter 4 of the Ugandan Constitution is purely about human rights.
Yes.
We even have laws that have been passed by Parliament to safeguard and promote respect for human rights. For instance, we have got the Anti-Torture Act that was passed a few years ago, prohibiting torture. We have the Human Rights Enforcement Act that was passed, I think, in 2018 or 2019 by Parliament, again to prohibit torture. We have got the laws that set up the Uganda Human Rights Commission. It was created under the Constitution. It also has an enabling framework that governs it. So, on paper, in terms of the framework that is supposed to govern respect for human rights, you could say we have the framework. So the problem is not whether we have laws that prohibit violation of human rights. Okay. We have plenty of them. Okay. So, as a country, we would get a 4 out of 10, as far as I'm concerned, for what we have on paper. Okay. Why wouldn't we reach the pass mark? Because there is quite a huge difference between what we have on paper and what happens in practice.
So in terms of execution, would you say that we have actually been able to fulfill what we have on paper, and why?
No. We have performed extremely poorly. I think the biggest problem we have as a country is the culture of respect for human rights, which really, first and foremost, it comes from a culture of constitutionalism and respect for the rule of law. Okay. When you do not have a culture of respecting the rule of law, then obviously, if the laws you must respect are those protecting human rights, you're not going to respect them. So it's not something that is largely about it's not a human rights crisis alone. It's what we have is a crisis of lawlessness. There are so many people who do not believe in respect for the rule of law. Okay. So if the state organs do not respect the law, they will always pay lip service to the provisions in the Constitution and the Acts of Parliament about human rights. And that is what we see. The president will write letters saying, please, people don't torture, it is a mistake. He uses words in some of the letters. 2 letters of his has written about torture. He calls it a mistake. He does, in fact, in the last letter that the president wrote, he does not say it's a violation of the Constitution. He does not say it's a violation of the Anti-Torture Act. He does not say a person doing that is committing a crime and should be penalized according to the law. He simply says it's a mistake, and because it's a mistake, people should stop it. That is all. That obviously is really lip service. because for sure the president knows that the constitution prohibits torture. He knows there is an act of parliament. He's the one who assents to those laws. In any case, nobody else does it for him.
Absolutely.
So that is really an indicator of the challenge that we have. We have amassed a whole body of laws that are supposed to encourage respect for human rights, but the culture itself is non-existent. We have an outcry today because of some of these horrendous stories that we have seen in the press. This one of the novelist Kakwenza, the NUP coordinator from Kasese. But believe you me, those stories are all over the press. Even if we were to use the state organs, like the Uganda Human Rights Commission, it publishes reports. Those reports routinely point out that there are serious human rights abuses, largely perpetrated by the security organs. So it's not something new. It's only maybe that some of these 2-3 cases, because they may involve prominent personalities, or somehow the media has done its work and tried to highlight these cases. But we have got an epidemic of human rights violations in this country.
Now, looking at the different incidences, some of which you have actually pointed out, what is your take or what are your sentiments towards these events in regard to human rights? Because from where I'm standing and listening to you, you say that a lot has been put on paper. A lot of people have come out to, condemn this act, but nothing is actually being executed.
Yeah. Part of the problem that we see, how cases like Kakwenza's or the NUP coordinator Masereka's, how those cases arise is, if nobody is being held accountable, these two have been victims of torture, but they are not the last. Why? No one is going to be held accountable. And when we talk about accountability, obviously for us lawyers, accountability has there are two aspects to it. One, there is restitution of victims. In other words, ensuring that victims of torture are compensated. Occasionally that happens. Even then, I can assure you, courts of law have made awards of damages in favor of victims of torture. Some of them die before they ever even get that money from the government of Uganda. So that's an aspect of restitution. But accountability of have the perpetrators been brought to book? We hardly have any cases, none, of people who have been taken before the courts of law and have been charged because they were engaged in acts of torture against any person who has been detained. We hardly have any. The practice has been, in the historical context of Uganda, you realize, for instance, between 1985 and maybe 1990s, a number of people, especially security officers from the foreign regimes, were tried. For instance, I recall, I think it must have been 1988, a former Inspector General of Police, it must have been the late Kasim Obura, was actually tried for, I think, kidnap and intent to murder, and he was actually convicted, sentenced to death, and he was actually hanged. Of course, that's a bit of an extreme. I mean the sentence. But you see, the culture seems to be that the only people who can be held accountable are those from past regimes. Therefore, when you have got a government that is running into its 36th year, we'll probably be thinking, are we going to wait until maybe one day they can be held accountable? I do hope that one day people can be held accountable. But you see, if we had a culture of respect for the rule of law, which would in turn create a respect for human rights, we should be penalizing these individuals, because it shouldn't appear to be government policy. Because when you host some of these government functionaries, they're going to tell you, no, government respects human rights. That's why we have the constitution. That's why we have these laws which have been passed by parliament. And maybe, in a sense, they may have a point. But the implementation, the execution of what we have in the legal framework is a big problem. Very important. And ultimately, that is what matters. Execution is what matters. What we have on paper is really just theoretical.
It's not what we see.
If nobody is going to be charged, or you simply get some few cosmetic appearances before a court and then someone goes free, you don't have accountability. And if you don't have accountability, you create a culture of impunity, because people know they can get away with it, and then gradually they will not even know that it's actually against the law. We have occasionally argued with some members in the security circles. about this 48-hour rule. The Constitution requires that a person who has been arrested must be brought before the courts of law within 48 hours.
Yes.
And
yes.
if that's not done, the person should be released. Or if they're in police cells, given police bond. At almost all the major police stations you go to in this country, you'll definitely find suspects who have been in cells for way more than 48 hours. And it has become a norm. So you see, that's what breeds impunity. It starts with those small things, detaining somebody beyond 48 hours. And it becomes the norm, nobody cares.
And then
there are no consequences. Then gradually, that's how the torture also starts. People are detained in ungazetted places. The Constitution requires that a person who has been detained because he or she is a suspect of an offense must be detained in a gazetted place. And his or her relatives should be able to know. Okay? The person should be able to access medical treatment, should have access to a lawyer. Again, those are rarely complied with. People are detained incognito for even a month, like this Kakwenza gentleman. Someone is detained, the lawyers don't know where he is, the family does not know where he is being denied medical treatment, and then out of the blue, the person is clandestinely presented before a court of law and charged and then remanded to prison. And that's when the family gets to know that, oh, he has now been charged and remanded. We should be asking questions because you see, torture is, we are looking at one of the worst human rights violations. But you see, there are several violations that take place to lead to torture.
Yes.
The moment a person is detained in a place which is not gazetted, which is not known, that's a breeding ground for torture. If that were not happening, if we knew that Kakwenza was detained at the Jinja Road Police Station, obviously we would be asking the DPC at the Jinja Road Police and the OC station to explain what happened to Kakwenza. But as you can see, they hide the people who detain these, who carry out the detentions are not known. We can only speculate that these are people in security organs.
Okay.
We don't know that it's police, we don't know that it is the army, we do not know whether they are it's some paramilitary group or whatever it is.
So Jude, while we're even talking about accountability and people held accountable to some of these events that are taking place in the country, Uganda, do you think it also goes back to the aspect? I mean, let's look at the torture, the victims that have gone through this torture. How many of them actually are able or willing to come out and talk about their experiences? Wouldn't you say that actually that is a fuel or a cause as to why we are not taking this matter seriously?
I think victims, torture is can be a very traumatic experience. I've represented one or two individuals in the past who have been victims of torture. It's a very traumatic experience, and not everyone is going to be as courageous as Kakwenza to talk about their experience of torture. Actually, for some people, once they are tortured and they are warned, if you ever talk about it, we shall come for you. That's enough for them to just keep quiet. Because I know we had a scenario, we had a couple, a man and his wife, who were detained, I think, for over 3 years in a gazetted detention. And they were badly tortured. And then eventually, I think they were dumped on the roadside somewhere in Mbarara. And after some time, they actually went to the court, and the court awarded them damages. But you see, and even the court was alarmed that such a thing had happened in this country. And why? Because these were individuals, I think, who were supporters of one politician or another. So victims can and should come forward, should step forward. But we need to appreciate that that's not the best way to approach this whole question of torture, because it's a very traumatic experience, and there are very few people who even want to be able to talk about it.
Yes. Especially
when the perpetrators of the torture are still able to do the same. Because this is not the first time Kakwenza was tortured. He was tortured the other year. He was again detained in incognito and then eventually released when he had been tortured. He had been suffering actually some traumatic experiences before. So not everybody is going to be able to speak out. What is more critical is that we need more people who have a role to play in this country, being able to speak out and walking the talk. We need to see people being charged before courts of law in public for perpetrating acts of torture. We need people who are supervisors of these detention facilities, whether gazetted or not gazetted, being called to account. As long as that is not happening, we'll continue in this cycle where there is a public outcry, because this is not the first time for sure that we're having an outcry.
Absolutely.
I remember
yes.
we had one a few years ago when there was the then I think mayor of Kamwenge Town Council, and he had been badly tortured, and then there was an outcry. And then at the end of the day, it's blamed maybe on the IGP, General Kale Kaihura, who was there at the time. But you see he's no longer there, and we still have the same. Meaning it's a systemic problem that you cannot pin on these lower level individuals. The only individual who can really answer for why do these things occur is the president.
So
because he's the commander in chief.
Person that should be held accountable for all these acts.
Absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, he's the commander in chief. I'm not very sure that there is any army officer who will be given a directive, please, I don't want you to torture any detainee, and they will go ahead and do it. Because they can be court-martialed. He's the commander in chief. Okay. He can dismiss them from the army. He has a lot he can do. But that's why I started by focusing on his mindset, as demonstrated by the letters he has written about the question of torture. And I indicated to you that you see in his letters, he's simply saying torture is like an operational mistake. He does not say it's a violation of a constitutional right. He does not say it's a serious crime that must be punished. And yet, historically, torture is one of those crimes for which, world over, people have insisted on accountability, even years after the event. For instance, even a few years ago, in Germany, we still have people who are in charge of the Nazi concentration camps, still being charged. People who are 90 years of age, and probably have even forgotten what they did when they were 25 years of age, when they were maybe soldiers or warders in the Nazi concentration camps. And they are being charged, they are being taken before the courts of law when they are 90 years of age, 85 years of age, to answer, because there is a global consensus that torture is a serious crime for which there must be accountability.
Okay.
And that's what we need to, that's where for me, that's where we need to focus our national conversation on this question of respect for human rights.
Okay.
Accountability in terms of bringing the perpetrators to book. In terms of people going to courts of law being awarded damages, because I've had one of the talking points people have been raising that, well, Kakwenza can go to court, is awarded damages. Is that going to change anything?
It doesn't change any, okay. Now, but also looking at the way forward, there's some MPs, we have people like MP Joyce Bagala who decided to actually wear some of the t-shirts to have end torture. We have had the opposition MPs who have decided that they will decide to abscond parliamentary sittings until the issue of torture is addressed. Do you think that this is a right move and the way to go?
I think it's these are token reactions. I wouldn't discount them because they also help to shed light on this important issue. But more needs to be done, even by the legislators, even the opposition legislators. Yes, there may be a minority in parliament, but more needs to be done. First and foremost, for me, this is an issue that has been going on for quite a while. And I don't think they should first wait for two major incidents to break out for them to have a firm reaction. They should always have it as part of their agenda, respect for human rights. I would actually want to see them lobbying more intensely in Parliament for the Committee on Human Rights should be ideally also be led by an opposition-leaning legislator, because in Parliament, accountability committees are usually traditionally are led by the minority in the House. That is like Public Accounts Committee, then the Committee on State Enterprises. I think they need to make the case that where we have reached as a country, in Parliament, they need to demand that they should be given the opportunity to oversee the committee that reports on questions of human rights. Okay. So they can call the state to account, because we have a lot of systemic problems that they could address even at their level. Of course, going to the courts of law, again, is not something that we should discount. It has its role to play. Some of these incidents need to be documented, no matter what, even if people are just awarded damages that the government will never pay or will pay after 10 years when some of them have even passed on. We still need to be able to build a record, a public record. So speaking out is very important. The boycotts are very important, but they are not all that can be done. There's still a lot that needs to be done.
Would you say that these MPs are politicking the issue at hand?
But it's a political issue. Torture of suspects is a political issue. So the whole idea that there can be no politics when we are talking about torture does not make sense to me. The constitution itself is a political document, technically.
Okay.
A constitution is a political document which gives guidelines and a framework in how our society, how our country is supposed to be governed. It prohibits torture. Parliament has passed laws prohibiting torture. All those are technically political decisions. And the people who are perpetrating torture, first of all, a number of the victims have been tortured because of their political views or their belonging to certain political groups. So I find it futile for anyone to claim that we can talk about torture in a non-political context. It's simply not possible. Okay. Because people are not being tortured because they are supporting Manchester United or Arsenal. That's when we say let's not talk about politics.
Okay, so as we wrap up the conversation, and actually those were some of the images of the leader of opposition, that is Matthias Mpuga, who was actually there trying to give his remarks. However, as we wrap up the conversation, what are your last remarks in regard to the question of human rights?
There are a number of important considerations that as a country we have to continue thinking about. One, like I've indicated, accountability for perpetrators of human rights violations is something as a country we need to forcefully continue to make sure the public record checks whether there is accountability. We should not allow when these horrendous events happen, we should not move on as business as usual all the time. It's important for us to continue to follow up to ensure that there is public accountability. There have been a few incidents which would not fit in the framework of torture as such, but when I know some human rights violators were called to account. We had like SPC Ramadan Magara, who in 2005, 2006, opened fire on some people who I think on a campaign trail, and he was charged and eventually convicted by the courts of law, and he served a sentence of around 16 years in prison. But that was possible because even people in the media managed to follow up to the end to ensure there was accountability. So it's very important for us to push for accountability.
Yes.
It's futile to cry about torture, to cry about human rights violations, if we do not follow up to ask the more pertinent question of, is there going to be accountability? And then two, all of the means at our disposal are very important. There is so much that can be done legally. We cannot discount it. People should still go to the courts of law and either take legal action against the government of Uganda, and where they know the perpetrators, also take legal action against the perpetrators on an individual level. That needs to be done as well as part of the package of trying to ensure that we can tackle this problem of violations of human rights. And again, as citizens, we have to try to learn more about what our rights are. We should not allow our rights to be trampled upon, and then we let it go. It's very common, especially for people who have been accused of crimes and are detained.
Okay.
We should be able to ensure that every time there is a violation, there must be repercussions. As long as people are violating rights of suspects or rights of ordinary citizens, and there are no consequences, then we shall not be able to bring this impunity to an end.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning on this
Shivan.
conversation. Well, if you're just joining us or if you're just tuned in to Sunrise at Sea, my name is Shivan, and earlier on I was with Counsel Jude Biamukama, and he was giving us an insight in regard to the question of human rights. If you missed it, do not fret, because this particular segment will be uploaded later on our YouTube channel. Otherwise, up next, I sit down with the eye doctor, an eye specialist, to understand the importance of wearing glasses and when you can actually wear glasses, and also looking at the misconceptions or the perceptions that are had about people that wear glasses. That and more coming up in Sunrise at Sea, so you definitely do not want to miss. Good morning and don't blink.